At 1:23 in the morning, inside Reactor 4, a safety test was underway. A test designed to determine what would happen if the plant suddenly lost external power.
The city of Pripyat was asleep. Apartment windows glowed softly in the darkness. Children slept. Cars sat motionless beneath the streetlights. And inside the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, a routine safety test was underway. Then within seconds, everything changed. The night began quietly. Chernobyl was not some distant military installation hidden from the world. It was a working power station. And nearby was Pripyat, a planned Soviet city built around the plant. Wide apartment blocks stood beside parks, schools, shops, and quiet roads. There were ordinary routines, ordinary homes, ordinary nights. But inside Unit 4, engineers were preparing for a test. The question seemed simple. If the plant suddenly lost external electricity, could the spinning turbine continue producing enough electricity for a short period of time? That electricity could help keep essential equipment running until the emergency generators came online. The idea itself was not extraordinary. The problem was the condition of the reactor when the test was finally carried out. During preparations for the test, reactor power had fallen far below the level originally intended. Instead of a stable operating condition, the reactor was now in a difficult and unstable state. The operators tried to bring the power back up, but the reactor did not respond in the simple way they expected. There were also deeper problems. The RBMK reactor design had characteristics that could make certain low-power conditions dangerous. Some automatic systems had been bypassed or disabled as part of the test, and the operators were now working inside a system where several risks were beginning to overlap. Nothing had exploded yet. There was no fire, no smoke, no dramatic warning that history was about to change, only instruments, numbers, switches, and a reactor becoming increasingly difficult to control. At around 1:23 in the morning, the test began. Steam to the turbine was reduced. The conditions inside the reactor changed, and within moments the power began to surge. The emergency shutdown was initiated. It was supposed to bring the reactor to a rapid stop, but the reactor had a dangerous design characteristic. Under the conditions that existed inside Unit 4, the shutdown process could initially increase reactivity in parts of the core rather than immediately suppress it. The power rose violently. The reactor's power was rising so rapidly that the instruments could no longer keep pace with what was happening. Then came the explosion. The roof of Unit 4 was destroyed. The reactor building was torn open. Fire spread through the structure, and radioactive material was released into the atmosphere. Outside, the first response looked like an industrial emergency. Firefighters were sent toward the plant. They saw flames, they saw smoke, they saw a damaged building. But radiation could not be seen. It had no smell, no color, no visible warning. The firefighters fought the fire around a reactor that was no longer safely contained. Some were exposed to extremely high levels of radiation. They were confronting an enemy they could not see. And while this was happening, Pripyat remained largely unaware. The city was still there. The apartment buildings were still standing. The streetlights still illuminated the roads. People were sleeping. Morning arrived. Children looked out through apartment windows. Daily life continued around a disaster only a few kilometers away. Eventually, authorities began preparing an evacuation. Buses arrived. Thousands of residents were told to leave. They were instructed to take only essential belongings. Many believed they would return soon. They didn't. The evacuation transformed Pripyat almost instantly. A city built for ordinary life became a place suspended in time. Classrooms emptied, homes were abandoned, shops closed, and objects that had once been ordinary became silent reminders of the people who had left. But the disaster was not staying in Chernobyl. The explosion had released radioactive material high into the atmosphere. Winds carried contamination far beyond the plant. Radiation was detected outside the Soviet Union. Across Europe, monitoring stations began recording unusual readings. Governments started asking questions. What had happened? How large was the release? And why was radiation appearing hundreds of kilometers away? Chernobyl was no longer simply a Soviet accident. It had become an international nuclear disaster. The next challenge was enormous. The reactor had to be contained. Thousands of people were eventually sent into the exclusion zone and surrounding areas. They became known as liquidators. Soldiers, firefighters, engineers, miners, construction workers, specialists from across the Soviet Union. They were sent into an environment where radiation levels could be dangerously high. Some worked for minutes at a time. Some worked under strict exposure limits. Others handled tasks that had to be completed regardless of the danger. Radioactive debris had to be removed. Contaminated areas had to be controlled. And above the destroyed reactor, engineers had to construct a massive protective structure. The original structure, later known as the sarcophagus, was completed within months. It was an extraordinary engineering effort carried out under extremely dangerous conditions. But containing the reactor did not bring Pripyat back. The city remained abandoned. Years passed, then decades. Nature began moving into the spaces people had left behind. Trees grew through roads, vegetation covered buildings, empty classrooms gathered dust, and the amusement park became one of the most recognizable symbols of the abandoned city. Pripyat had once represented the future. Now it represented absence. The disaster also changed how the world thought about nuclear safety. Investigations found that Chernobyl was not the result of one simple mistake. Operator actions mattered, procedural decisions mattered, and fundamental weaknesses in the reactor design mattered. The catastrophe came from several failures interacting with one another: a dangerous operating condition, a flawed design, decisions made under pressure, and safety systems that were not enough to prevent the consequences. That is what makes Chernobyl so unsettling. The disaster did not begin with an explosion. It began with a system, a complicated system. A system containing weaknesses that were not fully understood, and a sequence of decisions that gradually pushed that system toward the edge. Chernobyl became one of the most studied technological disasters in history. Its lessons continue to influence nuclear safety, engineering, emergency planning, and risk management. But perhaps the deepest lesson is simpler. The most dangerous failures are rarely caused by one thing. They happen when small problems, bad decisions, and hidden weaknesses come together at exactly the wrong moment. And decades later, Chernobyl still stands as a reminder. Technology can become incredibly powerful, but complexity does not remove risk. It can sometimes hide it. On one night in 1986, a test designed to improve safety became one of the world's most infamous disasters. And the reactor was not the only thing that changed that night. A city disappeared, a landscape changed, an entire industry was forced to confront its weaknesses. And the world learned that some dangers are invisible until it is already too late. Chernobyl is remembered because of the explosion, but the real story is everything that happened before it: the decisions, the hidden weaknesses, the warning signs, and the consequences that continued long after the fire was gone. If you want more stories about technology, disasters, science, and the moments that changed the world, subscribe to Inflekta. Because sometimes understanding the past helps us see the present differently. Inflekta.
Stories that make you see the world differently.